The strangest thing about power is that the people who think they have all of it are usually the last to discover who really does. The first thing I saw that Monday morning was a bright orange notice taped across the front gate of my farmhouse, fluttering in the cool breeze as though it belonged there. Behind it stood 3 members of the Homeowners Association wearing matching polo shirts, clipboards tucked under their arms, while several neighbors watched from the gravel road with the kind of quiet curiosity that spreads faster than gossip in a small community. About 20 feet away, a white SUV sat idling beside a black luxury crossover that I immediately recognized as belonging to Victoria Langford, the president of our HOA. Even from a distance, she was impossible to miss. Her colorful designer jacket shimmered in the morning sunlight. Oversized gold jewelry reflected every movement she made, and her confident posture suggested she believed the entire valley answered to her. She wasn't shouting. She didn't have to. The calm certainty in her expression carried more weight than raised voices ever could. I parked my old pickup beside the red barn, stepped out, and walked toward the gate without rushing. My farmhouse had stood on that land for nearly 80 years, surrounded by rolling fields, old maple trees, and weathered fences that had outlived more county commissioners than I cared to count. Every board in that house had a story. Every acre had been worked by someone in my family long before luxury homes began filling the neighboring hillsides. Yet there they were, standing on my driveway as though history could be erased by paperwork printed the night before. Victoria smiled politely when I approached. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said, folding her hands in front of her. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." I glanced at the notice without removing it. Across the top, bold letters declared that the property was subject to immediate enforcement action pending HOA compliance review. Below there were references to architectural standards, community appearance guidelines, and language suggesting that continued noncompliance could ultimately result in legal action affecting my property rights. I looked back at Victoria. "That's a remarkable document," I said evenly, "especially considering my farmhouse predates your subdivision." She tilted her head slightly, almost amused. "Our attorneys have reviewed the matter carefully," she replied. "The board believes your property now falls within the governing authority established when the surrounding development expanded." Behind her, one of the board members nodded while another continued making notes on a clipboard as though today's outcome had already been decided. A few neighbors whispered quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing in my direction before quickly looking away. Nobody wanted to become part of the confrontation, but nobody wanted to miss it either. I had seen that look before. People are naturally drawn towards certainty, even when that certainty belongs to the wrong person. Victoria took a single step closer and lowered her voice just enough to sound reassuring. "Mr. Caldwell, if you cooperate now, this process can remain simple. We would much rather resolve everything amicably than escalate unnecessary complications." I almost smiled. There was something fascinating about hearing the word cooperate from someone standing on land she didn't own while explaining how my own property would soon be governed by her decisions. "And if I don't?" I asked. Her expression never changed. "Then the association will proceed according to its authority." The silence that followed stretched for several seconds. Somewhere beyond the pasture, I heard a tractor starting on another farm, followed by the distant sound of cattle moving toward a feeding area. It felt like any ordinary morning except for the growing audience gathered outside my gate. One neighbor quietly pulled out a phone, probably expecting the situation to become dramatic. Instead, I reached into my jacket, removed a pair of reading glasses, and carefully read every page attached to the notice from beginning to end. I didn't interrupt anyone. I didn't argue. I simply read. Victoria watched with visible confidence, convinced that every sentence strengthened her position. When I finished, I folded the papers neatly and handed them back. "Thank you," I said. "Now I understand exactly what you believe you're doing." She seemed pleased by my calm response, perhaps mistaking composure for surrender. "I'm glad we're making progress," she answered. I looked past her toward the elegant homes climbing the hillside beyond my fields, each one carrying polished stone entrances, freshly landscaped yards, and long rows of identical mailboxes stretching toward the main road. Then I looked back at Victoria and noticed something she couldn't possibly recognize yet. She believed today was the beginning of the end for my farmhouse. In reality, It was the first move in a story that would force everyone in that neighborhood to discover just how connected their future had always been to mine. Nobody moved for several seconds after I finished speaking. Victoria seemed satisfied with herself, almost relieved that I had not argued or torn the notice from the gate in some dramatic display. I had learned years earlier that people revealed far more when they believed they had already won. She adjusted the bright scarf draped over her designer jacket, glanced toward the other board members, and gave a subtle nod that suggested they could move to the next step on their checklist. One of them opened a leather folder and removed another packet of documents. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "this outlines the compliance schedule established by the board. You will have 30 days to remove the structures identified as inconsistent with community standards, repaint exterior surfaces using approved colors, replace the fencing visible from association property, and submit architectural plans for future review." I accepted the packet without comment. The list was almost impressive in its confidence. According to the board, my weathered red barn, my split-rail fence, and even the wraparound porch that had stood on the farmhouse for decades somehow required their approval. They had managed to reduce nearly 80 years of history into a series of violations printed on glossy paper. Victoria watched me carefully. "If you begin immediately," she said with a pleasant smile, "the board may consider reducing certain administrative penalties." I looked across my fields where morning sunlight stretched over the grass. A pair of horses wandered lazily near the northern pasture, completely unaware that a committee wearing matching polo shirts believed it could redesign the landscape surrounding them. "Tell me something," I said. "When did the association decide it had authority over this property?" She answered without hesitation. "When the county approved the expansion of the surrounding residential development. Our legal counsel determined that maintaining community standards requires consistent enforcement throughout the affected area." Her certainty never wavered. It was not arrogance fueled by emotion. It was something more dangerous. She genuinely believed every conclusion presented to her by the association had become unquestionable fact. I asked if she had personally reviewed the original property records. She replied that she relied on professionals. I asked whether anyone from the board had ever visited the county archives or examined the recorded easements attached to my land. Again, she answered that legal research had already been completed. Every response followed the same pattern. Someone else had assured her everything was correct, so there was no need to ask additional questions. Around us, several neighbors remained quietly gathered near the roadside. One older gentleman tipped his hat toward me, but said nothing. A young couple standing beside a golf cart exchanged uncertain looks before slowly walking away. They clearly did not enjoy watching the confrontation, yet neither of them seemed willing to question the association publicly. That was another lesson I had learned over the years. Most people preferred stability over conflict, even when stability depended on accepting questionable decisions. Victoria eventually checked her watch. "I appreciate your professionalism," she said. "Many homeowners become emotional during these conversations." I almost laughed at the choice of words. "I am not emotional because I have not reached any conclusions yet," I answered. "I have simply received your documents." She interpreted my response as cooperation. "Excellent," she said. "I believe we can avoid unnecessary complications." Within a few minutes, the board members climbed back into their vehicles. The white SUV pulled away first, followed by Victoria's luxury crossover, disappearing down the paved entrance leading toward the neighborhood beyond my fields. The silence that followed felt strangely peaceful. I carried both packets inside the farmhouse, placed them on the large oak table in my kitchen, and poured myself a cup of coffee before reading every page again. This time I paid attention to details instead of headlines. Dates, signatures, property descriptions, legal references. I highlighted several sections that immediately raised questions, then opened a locked cabinet in my office. Inside were carefully organized binders containing surveys, deeds, correspondence, tax records, and agreements accumulated over many years. Some people collected antiques. I collected documentation. Experience had taught me that memory could be challenged, opinions could be dismissed, but properly maintained records rarely lost their value. By early afternoon, the dining table had disappeared beneath maps and files arranged in chronological order. The more I compared their paperwork with my own, the clearer one fact became. This was not simply an aggressive homeowners association trying to expand its influence. Someone had built an entire enforcement strategy on assumptions that had never been tested against the complete history of the land. I leaned back in my chair and looked through the kitchen window toward the distant rooftops of the subdivision. Somewhere beyond those houses, decisions had been made by people who believed they understood exactly who they were dealing with. They knew I owned an old farmhouse. They knew I rarely attended public meetings. They knew I kept mostly to myself. What they did not know was that before the week was over, a single phone call would begin uncovering connections that reached far beyond property lines, association bylaws, or anything Victoria Langford imagined she controlled. Nearly every problem I had ever solved began the same way, not with a confrontation, but with a timeline. Before making a single phone call, I spread every document across the dining table and arranged them according to the date they had entered my life instead of the date the homeowners association had decided they mattered. The original deed came first, followed by county surveys, tax assessments, utility easements, agricultural permits, and correspondence dating back decades. By the time I finished organizing everything, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The farmhouse had never been incorporated into the residential subdivision the way Victoria and her board seemed to believe. My property bordered their development, but it had traveled through an entirely different chain of ownership and legal agreements. That distinction might have sounded insignificant to someone unfamiliar with property records, yet it often determined the difference between assumption and authority. Around noon, I drove into town, stopping first at the county records office where I had known several employees for years. The receptionist smiled as soon as I walked through the door. "Back for more history, Nathan?" she asked with a laugh. "History has a habit of becoming valuable," I replied. Within 20 minutes, I had certified copies of several recorded plats and easement maps that confirmed exactly what I had expected. My farmhouse remained governed under its original agricultural parcel despite the surrounding residential expansion. One of the clerks quietly pointed toward an older filing cabinet. "You might also want the annexation records from 15 years ago," she suggested. "Those usually answer questions before lawyers ask them." I thanked her, requested the additional files, and left with a folder noticeably thicker than the one I had carried inside. On the drive home, I passed the entrance to the subdivision. Landscapers trimmed hedges beside the decorative stone sign, while residents walked dogs along carefully maintained sidewalks. Everything appeared peaceful. It struck me that most of those families probably believed the homeowners association existed only to organize landscaping, maintain common areas, and schedule neighborhood events. Very few people ever examined the limits of authority until those limits reached their own front door. Early that afternoon, another envelope arrived by certified mail. The association had not wasted any time. This notice informed me that daily administrative penalties would begin accumulating if I failed to acknowledge the compliance schedule in writing. The wording remained polite from beginning to end, yet every paragraph carried the same message: cooperate now or expect increasing consequences later. I placed the letter beside the others without reacting. Emotional decisions often satisfied pride while creating expensive mistakes. I preferred patience. Around 3 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller identified herself as the association's legal coordinator and politely asked whether I intended to submit architectural plans before the stated deadline. I answered honestly, "Not until I understand why the association believes it has jurisdiction over my property." There was a brief silence before she responded. "Our legal department is confident in its position." "Confidence and documentation are not always the same thing," I replied. Her tone remained courteous, but noticeably more formal. "Then perhaps our attorneys should discuss the matter directly." "Perhaps they should," I answered before ending the call. I never raised my voice. There was no reason to. By late afternoon, I noticed 2 unfamiliar vehicles parked along the public road overlooking my fields. Neither entered my property. They simply remained there for several minutes before driving away. Curious, I walked to the mailbox where another neighbor happened to be collecting his own letters. Harold Jenkins had lived nearby since before the subdivision existed. He leaned against his pickup and shook his head. "Victoria has been telling people the association is finally bringing your place into compliance," he said carefully. "Sounds expensive." I smiled. "Only if she is right." He studied my expression for a moment. "You do not seem worried." "Worry is useful when you lack information," I replied. "I have been collecting information all day." Harold laughed quietly before climbing back into his truck. Well, whatever happens, half the neighborhood is watching. As evening settled across the farm, I returned to my office and opened a different cabinet from the one holding property records. Inside were neatly organized business files that almost nobody outside a very small professional circle knew existed. I selected one folder, opened it, and reviewed several pages before placing a single call. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. I did not explain the dispute in detail. I simply requested that several public records and organizational relationships be verified before the end of the week. The person on the other end responded with only one sentence. "We will have everything ready tomorrow morning." I thanked them, ended the call, and looked once more toward the lights beginning to appear across the subdivision. Victoria believed she was building pressure one notice at a time. She had no idea that while her board focused entirely on my farmhouse, I had quietly begun tracing the foundation beneath the entire neighborhood, and I was starting to suspect that the most important document in this story had nothing to do with property lines at all. The following morning began with another surprise, although this one arrived wrapped in confidence instead of certified mail. Shortly after 9 o'clock, 3 contractor trucks entered the subdivision and parked near the clubhouse. By lunchtime, I learned from Harold Jenkins that the association had hired a consulting firm to begin documenting what Victoria called neighborhood compliance concerns. According to the rumors already circulating through the community, my farmhouse had become the board's highest priority because it supposedly represented the last obstacle to creating a completely uniform appearance along the eastern entrance corridor. I found that description oddly fascinating. For decades, no one had complained that an 80-year-old farmhouse was somehow disrupting the scenery. Only after expensive homes filled the surrounding hillsides had history become inconvenient. Later that afternoon, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one invited me to attend a special board meeting scheduled for Friday evening. The stated purpose was to allow me one final opportunity to present my position before the association authorized additional enforcement measures. The language sounded courteous, almost generous, yet every sentence suggested that the outcome had already been decided. I accepted the invitation immediately. If people intended to reveal their assumptions publicly, I preferred having a front row seat. On Friday evening, I drove to the clubhouse a few minutes early. Luxury vehicles already filled most of the parking lot, and residents gathered in small groups discussing landscaping projects, upcoming community events, and, judging by the occasional glance in my direction, the farmhouse sitting just beyond the neighborhood entrance. As I walked inside, conversations briefly quieted before returning to normal. Victoria stood near the front of the meeting room greeting residents as though she were hosting a charity gala instead of a compliance hearing. Her colorful designer outfit was impossible to overlook. Bright patterns, oversized jewelry, and polished heels projected exactly the image she wanted, complete confidence. When she noticed me, she smiled warmly. "Mr. Caldwell, I am pleased you decided to attend," she said. "Transparency benefits everyone." I thanked her and took a seat near the middle of the room rather than the front. Within minutes, the meeting began. Routine agenda items moved quickly until Victoria introduced what she described as the property's ongoing compliance matter. A large photograph of my farmhouse appeared on the projection screen behind her. She calmly explained that architectural consistency protected long-term property values and that selective enforcement weakened community standards. Several board members nodded in agreement. She then outlined the notices already delivered to me and emphasized that I had not yet submitted any plans for compliance. One resident raised his hand and asked whether the property had always been part of the association. Victoria answered with remarkable confidence. Our legal review concluded that the board possesses the authority necessary to proceed. She did not mention any specific documents. She simply repeated that professional advice supported her position. Another resident asked whether the situation might eventually involve court proceedings. Victoria responded that she hoped cooperation would make further action unnecessary, but assured everyone the board was fully prepared to protect the community if required. Listening carefully, I realized something important. Nobody in the room appeared motivated by personal hostility. Most residents genuinely believed the board had already verified every fact. They trusted the process because they trusted the people presenting it. When Victoria finally invited me to speak, I stood slowly and thanked the board for allowing me to attend. I did not challenge anyone personally. Instead, I asked a simple question. Before making any final decision, how many members of the board have personally reviewed the original chain of title for my property? The room became noticeably quieter. Victoria answered first. Our legal advisors completed that review. I nodded politely. That was not my question. None of the board members raised a hand. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it revealed more than any argument could have. I thanked everyone for their time, explained that I was continuing my own review of the relevant records, and sat back down. Victoria quickly resumed the meeting, maintaining the same confident tone she had used all evening, yet I noticed several residents exchanging thoughtful looks for the first time. As the meeting concluded, she announced that unless circumstances changed, the board would soon authorize the next phase of enforcement. Walking back to my truck beneath the parking lot lights, I reached into my jacket and felt the folder that had arrived earlier that afternoon from my own verification request. I had not opened it yet because some discoveries were far more valuable when revealed at exactly the right moment, and I was beginning to believe that Victoria was about to create that moment herself. When I returned home that evening, I finally opened the folder that had been waiting on my desk since earlier that afternoon. The documents inside were exactly what I had requested, nothing sensational, nothing speculative, just verified public records assembled in a logical order. I read every page twice before placing them beside the property files I had already collected. Individually, each document seemed ordinary. Together, they painted a picture that no one on the Homeowners Association board appeared to have noticed. The subdivision had been developed in multiple phases over several years. Most buyers had financed their homes through different local lenders at first, but those loans had eventually been consolidated through a single regional mortgage institution after a series of acquisitions. The records also identified the current parent company responsible for that institution. I smiled quietly because the name was very familiar. Most people recognized the consumer brand printed on monthly mortgage statements, but very few paid attention to the holding company several layers above it. That level of ownership rarely mattered to homeowners. It mattered to investors, regulators, and people who spent years studying financial structures. Early the next morning, I received another call, this time from a longtime business associate named Rebecca Monroe. She had worked in commercial finance for more than 2 decades and understood the importance of confirming facts before reaching conclusions. Everything matches the records, she said. There have been no recent ownership changes, and the organizational structure is exactly as you expected. I thanked her and asked one additional question. How many active mortgages remain in that subdivision? I heard papers turning before she answered. The overwhelming majority. Only a handful of properties appear to be owned without financing. I thanked her again and ended the call. Even then, I had no intention of using that information as leverage. My goal had never been to intimidate anyone. I simply wanted to understand the complete landscape before deciding how to respond. Later that afternoon, another certified letter arrived from the association. This one informed me that because I had not accepted the proposed compliance schedule, the board intended to authorize formal legal proceedings during its next executive session. The wording remained professional, yet the tone had changed. They no longer expected cooperation. They expected resistance, and they believed they were fully prepared for it. I placed the letter beside the others and continued working through my notes. Around sunset, Harold Jenkins stopped by the farm carrying a homemade pie his wife insisted I accept. We sat on the porch overlooking the fields while the evening air cooled. After a few minutes, he finally asked the question that had obviously been bothering him. Nathan, are you really going to fight the association? I looked across the pasture before answering. I am going to correct the facts. He nodded slowly. People around the neighborhood think Victoria already has everything under control. That is because they only know the part of the story she has shared. Harold leaned back in his chair. She certainly sounds confident. Confidence is useful, I replied. It just becomes dangerous when it replaces verification. Before leaving, Harold paused near his truck and turned back toward me. There is another board meeting next week. I heard they plan to vote on moving everything to their attorneys. I thanked him for the information after he drove away, then walked back into my office where the financial records remained spread across the desk. My eyes settled once more on the parent company listed at the top of the ownership chart. I had helped build that organization over many years through acquisitions, mergers, and patient investments. Very few people outside the financial industry associated my name with it because I had never sought public attention. The company preferred operating quietly, allowing its regional institutions to maintain their own identities. That approach had served everyone well for years. It also explained why Victoria had never connected my farmhouse with the organization financing most of her neighborhood. She saw an aging farmer living beside a modern subdivision. She never imagined that the quiet man refusing to argue at board meetings spent his weekdays overseeing decisions affecting financial institutions across several states. I closed the folder, locked it inside my desk, and looked out the office window toward the lights scattered across the hillside homes. Somewhere inside those houses, residents were probably reading mortgage statements bearing a familiar local logo without giving the company behind it a second thought. They had no reason to. Within a few days, however, the board intended to transform an unnecessary property dispute into a formal legal conflict. And when that happened, the question would no longer be whether Victoria believed she had authority over my farmhouse. The real question would be how she intended to explain her decisions after discovering who ultimately stood behind the institution connected to nearly every mortgage in the neighborhood. Nearly a week had passed since Victoria first appeared at my gate, and by Friday morning the atmosphere around the subdivision had changed in subtle ways. More residents slowed their cars as they passed my farmhouse. A few offered polite waves. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Rumors had clearly traveled faster than facts. Shortly after breakfast, another certified envelope arrived confirming that the Homeowners Association had formally scheduled a vote that evening to authorize its attorneys to begin the next phase of enforcement. The letter described the meeting as a procedural necessity, almost routine, as though my farmhouse had already become another administrative item waiting to be checked off a list. I folded the notice, placed it beside the others, and finished my coffee before opening the folder that contained the financial records I had been carefully protecting. Every page had now been independently verified. Every ownership transfer had been confirmed. Every corporate relationship matched public filings. There was no uncertainty left, only timing. Around noon, my assistant, Rebecca Monroe, called once more. "Everything is ready if you decide to move forward," she said. "The legal team has prepared certified organizational records, and the corporate secretary has confirmed their authenticity." I thanked her, but reminded her that no documents would be presented unless they became necessary. "Understood," she replied. "I still think they have no idea who they are dealing with." "That is exactly why I would rather let them explain their position completely before I explain mine," I answered. By early evening, I drove back to the clubhouse. The parking lot was noticeably fuller than the previous meeting. Residents stood outside talking in small groups, while board members carried folders into the building. Victoria greeted nearly everyone by name, moving through the crowd with the confidence of someone expecting another uncomplicated victory. Her colorful designer outfit immediately drew attention, and the oversized gold necklace resting over her bright jacket reflected the overhead lights every time she turned. She noticed me entering the lobby and smiled as though we were old acquaintances. "Mr. Caldwell," she said warmly, "I hope you have reconsidered. The board would prefer a cooperative resolution." "So would I," I replied. She appeared encouraged by that answer, although she misunderstood what I meant. The meeting began precisely at 7 o'clock. Routine business occupied the first 15 minutes before Victoria introduced the final agenda item. She summarized the notices delivered to my property, reviewed the alleged violations once again, and recommended that the board authorize legal counsel to pursue all available remedies if compliance did not occur within the existing deadline. Her presentation was polished, organized, and delivered with complete confidence. Several residents nodded as she spoke. Others quietly reviewed printed agendas without asking questions. Then the association's attorney stood and briefly explained the proposed authorization. He emphasized that the board believed it possessed sufficient authority to proceed based on the information currently available. I listened carefully to every word. He never claimed absolute certainty. He repeatedly referred to the information currently available. That distinction mattered. When Victoria invited final comments before the vote, I stood and thanked the board for allowing me to speak. "I have only one request," I said calmly. "Before any vote takes place, Would the board be willing to confirm that every member understands the broader legal and financial relationships connected to this matter? Victoria answered before anyone else could respond. Mr. Caldwell, tonight concerns your property, not unrelated financial issues. I nodded politely. That depends entirely on how one defines unrelated. The room became noticeably quieter. Several residents looked from me to Victoria and back again. The attorney adjusted his glasses and watched without interrupting. I continued in the same calm tone. During the last meeting, I asked whether any board member had personally reviewed the complete chain of title affecting my property. Tonight, I have a different question. Before authorizing legal action, has anyone reviewed the ownership structure connected to the financial institution holding the overwhelming majority of mortgage loans throughout this subdivision? A murmur spread quietly across the room. Victoria frowned slightly. I do not understand what that has to do with association enforcement. Neither did I answered, until I completed my own review. I reached into my briefcase but did not remove any documents. Instead, I rested my hand on the folder and looked toward the association's attorney. His expression had changed almost imperceptibly. He no longer appeared confident. He appeared curious. That single change told me more than any speech could have. For the first time since this entire dispute began, someone in the room had realized there might be an important piece of the story the board had never investigated, and I could tell from the silence settling over the audience that whatever happened next would not resemble the straightforward vote Victoria had confidently promised only minutes earlier. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after my question. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the sound of certainty beginning to give way to curiosity. Victoria looked toward the association attorney with an expression that suggested she expected him to dismiss my comment immediately, but he did not. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and asked the first genuinely careful question anyone on the board had asked since this entire dispute began. Mr. Caldwell, he said, are you suggesting there is a financial relationship connected to this matter that the board has not considered? I nodded once. I am suggesting that before authorizing legal action, every board member deserves to understand the complete picture. Victoria folded her arms across her bright designer jacket and smiled politely, although the confidence in that smile had begun to fade around the edges. Nathan, she said, this meeting concerns property compliance. We are not discussing banking. Actually, I replied, that distinction is exactly the reason we are here tonight. I opened the folder resting on the table in front of me and removed only 3 documents. There was no dramatic gesture, no thick stack of papers, just 3 certified records placed neatly on the podium where everyone could see them. I handed the first document to the association attorney. He examined the certification seal before reading the title. His eyes moved slowly down the page. Then he accepted the second document. By the time he reached the third, his expression had changed completely. He was no longer evaluating an argument. He was verifying facts. Victoria noticed the shift immediately. Is there a problem? She asked. He did not answer right away. Instead, he continued reading before carefully placing all 3 documents back on the table. These appear to be certified corporate ownership records, he said quietly. They are, I replied. They identify the parent organization that owns the financial institution servicing the overwhelming majority of mortgages throughout this subdivision. Several residents exchanged confused looks. One gentleman near the back whispered something to his wife, while another quietly opened the banking application on his phone, probably looking at the logo printed on his monthly payment. Victoria gave a short laugh. Even if that is true, I still do not understand why it matters. I looked directly at her. Because I own the parent company. The room became completely still. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Even the air conditioning seemed louder than the people sitting around it. Victoria blinked twice before speaking. I am sorry, she said carefully. What exactly are you claiming? I am not making a claim, I answered. I am stating a fact supported by the certified records your attorney is holding. The attorney slowly nodded. The documents identify Nathan Caldwell as the majority owner and chairman of the holding company. Another board member leaned toward him. Are you certain? The certification appears authentic, he replied. I have no reason to believe otherwise. I could see the realization spreading through the room one person at a time. Residents who had spent years mailing mortgage payments to a familiar regional lender suddenly understood that the quiet man living in the old farmhouse had never simply been another property owner. I had deliberately kept my professional life separate from my personal one because I preferred privacy over attention. That privacy had worked so well that the association built an entire enforcement strategy without recognizing whose property they were targeting. Victoria remained remarkably composed, but the certainty that had defined every conversation we had shared was gone. "If what you are saying is accurate," she began, "are you threatening the neighborhood financially?" I shook my head immediately. "Absolutely not. That has never been my intention." I paused long enough to make certain everyone was listening. The mortgages held by homeowners are legal agreements. They remain exactly as they were yesterday, and nothing discussed tonight changes those obligations in any way. I have never used my business interests to influence private disputes, and I never will. The attorney gave a small approving nod. Several residents visibly relaxed. "Then why tell us this now?" someone asked from the audience. "Because the board was preparing to begin legal proceedings against me while assuming I was simply refusing to cooperate," I answered. "I wanted everyone to understand that I had every opportunity to respond with influence, yet I chose documentation instead. I asked questions. I verified records. I attended meetings. I listened. I gave the board every chance to examine the complete facts before reaching this point." Victoria slowly lowered her hands to the table in front of her. For the first time since she had appeared at my farmhouse, she looked less like someone delivering instructions and more like someone reconsidering assumptions. The attorney cleared his throat before addressing the board. "Madam President," he said carefully, "before any vote proceeds, I strongly recommend postponing this matter until the association conducts a comprehensive legal review of both the property records and the additional information presented this evening." Several board members immediately looked toward Victoria, waiting for her decision, and I realized that the meeting had quietly transformed from a routine enforcement vote into something entirely different, because the greatest surprise was no longer who I was. It was the realization that every confident decision the board had made over the past week had been built upon an incomplete understanding of the very situation they believed they controlled. The attorney's recommendation changed the atmosphere in the room more effectively than anything I could have said. A meeting that had begun with complete confidence now revolved around careful questions, legal definitions, and quiet conversations between board members who only minutes earlier had appeared ready to authorize another enforcement step without hesitation. Victoria remained standing at the front of the room with both hands resting on the conference table. Her colorful jacket and bold jewelry still projected authority, but her expression had become noticeably more thoughtful. She looked toward the attorney again. "Are you recommending that we suspend the vote entirely?" she asked. He answered without hesitation. "Yes. I believe that is the most responsible course of action until the association completes a comprehensive review of every document relevant to this matter." One board member frowned. "Does this mean we have made a mistake?" The attorney chose his words carefully. "It means additional facts have been presented that should have been examined before reaching a final conclusion. Responsible governance requires adapting when new information becomes available." That answer settled over the room in complete silence. Several residents who had remained seated throughout the meeting slowly lowered the printed agendas they had been holding. Their attention was no longer on my farmhouse. It had shifted toward the process the association had followed. A woman sitting near the center of the room politely raised her hand. "May I ask something?" Victoria nodded. "Of course. If the board never reviewed the complete property records and never understood the larger legal relationships before sending enforcement notices, how many other decisions have been made the same way?" Nobody answered immediately. It was an honest question, and that made it more powerful than any accusation. Another resident stood a few rows behind her. "I am not worried about Nathan's mortgage company," he said. "He already made it clear he is not using that against anyone. I am worried that we trusted the board to verify important facts before threatening legal action." Several quiet voices agreed. I remained where I was without interrupting. This meeting was no longer about defending myself. The residents had begun asking the questions that mattered most. Victoria finally spoke. "Every decision made by this board has always been intended to protect the community." I believe she meant those words sincerely. The problem had never been her motivation. The problem was that confidence had gradually replaced verification. The attorney gently cleared his throat once again. Intentions are important, he said. However, proper procedure is equally important. When authority is exercised, it must rest upon complete and accurate information. One of the newer board members slowly closed his binder. I do not feel comfortable voting tonight, he admitted. Another agreed almost immediately. Neither do I. Within moments, the remaining members expressed similar concerns. The unanimous certainty that had existed at the beginning of the meeting had disappeared entirely. Victoria looked around the room before taking a slow breath. Very well, she said. The proposed vote is postponed pending a full, independent legal review. No one applauded. No one celebrated. Instead, the room seemed to exhale all at once. Residents began speaking quietly with one another while the attorney gathered the certified records I had provided. Before handing them back, he looked directly at me. Mr. Caldwell, thank you for presenting this information before the association proceeded further. I appreciate your willingness to examine it, I replied. As people slowly left the meeting room, several homeowners stopped to introduce themselves. One couple apologized for assuming the rumors they had heard were accurate. Another resident thanked me for remaining calm throughout the process because, as he put it, the conversation never became personal even when it easily could have. I appreciated every kind word, but I reminded each of them that the real objective was not proving someone wrong. It was making sure future decisions rested on complete facts instead of incomplete assumptions. Victoria remained behind after most of the room had emptied. She walked toward me carrying the same folder she had confidently presented throughout the previous meetings. Her voice was noticeably quieter than usual. Nathan, she said, I still believe protecting the neighborhood matters. I know, I answered. That was never the problem. She looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. Perhaps I trusted the process more than I questioned it. I nodded. Leadership sometimes requires asking uncomfortable questions before asking everyone else to accept comfortable answers. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she slowly closed the folder and held it against her side. For the first time since this dispute began, there was no trace of confrontation between us, only a shared recognition that authority carried responsibilities extending far beyond confidence alone. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I noticed small groups of neighbors still talking beneath the parking lot lights. They were no longer discussing my farmhouse or speculating about enforcement notices. They were discussing transparency, oversight, and how the association should move forward after discovering that one overlooked assumption had nearly led an entire community down the wrong path. The weeks that followed felt very different from the tension that had surrounded my farmhouse only days earlier. The independent legal review moved forward exactly as the association attorney had recommended, and when the final report was completed, it confirmed what the original records had shown from the beginning. My farmhouse had never become subject to the homeowners association in the manner the board had assumed, and several of the enforcement steps that had already been initiated should never have been approved without additional verification. Shortly afterward, every notice previously delivered to my property was formally withdrawn. The proposed legal action was canceled before it ever reached a courtroom, and the board announced that it would conduct a comprehensive review of its internal procedures before pursuing similar matters in the future. I appreciated that decision because correcting a mistake mattered far more than pretending it had never happened. A few days later, Victoria called and asked whether I would be willing to meet privately at the farmhouse. When she arrived, she was dressed far more simply than during our previous meetings, although her colorful style remained unmistakable. She stood on the porch for a moment, looking across the fields before speaking. Nathan, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. I invited her inside, poured 2 cups of coffee, and listened. She admitted that she had become so confident in the association's internal process that she had stopped asking the questions every responsible leader should ask. She had relied on summaries instead of original records and assumptions instead of complete verification. I thanked her for saying so because acknowledging an error often required more strength than defending one. She then surprised me with another request. She asked whether I would be willing to attend the association's next board workshop and explain how large organizations manage documentation, review procedures, and decision-making before important actions are approved. I smiled because that request represented something much more valuable than an apology. It represented a willingness to improve. A month later, I accepted the invitation. Residents, board members, and even the association's attorney gathered in the clubhouse once again, but this meeting felt entirely different from the earlier ones. Nobody came expecting conflict. Instead, everyone arrived carrying notebooks instead of assumptions. We discussed why original documents mattered, why independent verification protected everyone involved, and why authority became stronger when it welcomed questions instead of discouraging them. Victoria listened carefully throughout the discussion and occasionally added her own observations about the importance of slowing down before making decisions that affected other people's lives. Watching that change reminded me that good leadership is not measured by never making mistakes. It is measured by having the humility to recognize them and the discipline to improve afterward. As for my farmhouse, very little changed. The old barn remained exactly where it had always been. The weathered fence continued following the same property line it had for decades. Every morning, I still walked across the fields with a cup of coffee while the sun rose over the hills, and every evening I watched the lights come on throughout the neighborhood that had unintentionally become part of one of the most memorable lessons of my life. People occasionally asked why I never used my financial position to pressure the association after everything that happened. The answer was always simple. Influence should never replace integrity. If I had responded with intimidation instead of facts, I would have become part of the very problem I hoped to solve. Respect earned through fairness lasts much longer than compliance earned through fear. Looking back now, I rarely think about the notices taped to my gate or the meetings filled with disagreement. Instead, I remember the moment when an entire room chose curiosity over certainty and facts over assumptions. That was the real turning point. Communities grow stronger when people are willing to admit that no title, no position, and no organization is above asking one more question before making an important decision. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson I carried away from the entire experience. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the one with the loudest voice or the greatest authority. It is the one who remains patient long enough for the truth to speak for itself. I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts after listening to this story. If you had been in my position, would you have handled the situation differently? Or do you think patience and documentation were the right approach from the beginning? Share your perspective in the comments because thoughtful discussions often teach us as much as the stories themselves. And if you enjoy character-driven stories about integrity, leadership, and unexpected reversals that remind us why facts matter, consider subscribing so you will not miss future stories that explore the choices people make when character is tested the most.